webinar Preparing for Interview. My name is Holly Mulvihill-Clark and I'm part of the Learning and Development team here at IIRSM. Your speaker today is Tara Waterman, Operations Director at the Recruiter Principal People. Thank you for joining us today, Tara.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. Before I hand over, there are just a few things to run through first. So to begin with, you'll be on mute for the duration of the webinar. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to use the questions area on the right-hand side of your screen to ask these. And we'll take 5 to 10 minutes at the end of Tara's presentation to run through those. If you need any help or guidance using the system, click the I symbol on your toolbar to be directed through to the support site. And finally, this webinar is being recorded and a copy of the recording will be placed on the IIRSM YouTube channel after the event. Okay, that's enough from me. Tara, I'm now going to give you presenting rights so that you can share your presentation with us.
Great, thank you. Fantastic.
And that's fantastic. We can see your screen now.
Lovely. Okay, that's great. Has that filled the screen now, Holly?
It has, yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay, that's great. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time to come along. I'll cover as much as I can in the time that we have, and we'll leave the opportunity at the end for questions, as Holly mentioned. And of course, if anybody has any further questions, if there's documents or hints and tips that we refer to that you'd like some more information on, please feel free to contact me via LinkedIn or my email address, and I'd be really pleased to support you. So we're going to talk today, as you know, about preparing for your interview. There is so much focus on this at the moment, as there always has been, but in particular because organisations are at times opting to interview virtually and then move forward through to second stage face-to-face. So preparing for interview has changed greatly in the past year or so. And I'm going to focus today on a bit of both virtual interviews and physical. Okay, so some key things to remember for any interview that you're going across to. Most interviewers will make a decision within their first 90 seconds. I'm sure you can all think of times that you've made a snap decision of somebody that you've met for the first time. First impressions really do count, and that can be particularly difficult when you are virtual. So it will take a bit longer for them to get that first impression virtually, but particularly for face-to-face, it's going to be quite a quick decision that they make. Your overall confidence is key. Now, that isn't to say to be sort of, triumphant about your achievements throughout your career, although we will spend time talking today about the level of appropriateness of what you discuss for your key achievements. But your confidence in your ability and your ability to articulate your answers well, which we'll focus on today, is really important. And of course, as we all know, confidence comes from preparation, which we will discuss today. Brevity and clarity are of course key in answering all interview questions. And again, that comes from practice. We see a great number of candidates who have so much goodness to say about their experience that it's actually really difficult for them to try and summarize it in a concise answer. But you just need to practice that over and over again and really hone in on that skill. If your interview is physical, arrive 10 to 15 minutes early. The traffic is wildly changing on a daily basis, as I'm sure some of you have found. We're almost back to pre-COVID times now with traffic in the morning, for example. So do make sure you plan your route. It sounds really, really simple, but sometimes with the mad rush of life, it's difficult to remember to do it. If your interview is virtual, if you want to arrive online early, that's fine. Just, I would suggest switching off your camera and muting yourself until you hear somebody join. Remember that it's quite unhelpful sometimes for somebody to join an interview, 10 to 15 minutes early online, because there's that awkwardness that actually lots of us are back to back at the moment. You may literally just be sitting there online until they're ready. So I think 5 minutes is totally appropriate if your interview's virtual. Bring copies of your CV and also bring the questions that you've prepared to ask, which we'll talk about later on in the webinar. I think it's really wonderful when candidates arrive with printed or written out copies of the questions that they have, because it really shows that you have put thought and energy into preparing for the interview. Things to completely avoid. Avoid speaking negatively about your current or previous role. I'm so sorry, I'm just struggling to see my screen. Just bear with me, just trying to move this away. Oh, Holly, sorry, I can't.
That's okay. You can come out of the slideshow and then reopen it again. That might help. Or if you've got, is it the toolbar on the right hand side?
Yes, which is the toolbar. I just can't get it to
is there
escape.
a red arrow at the top? There we go. No problem.
I got there in the end. Thank you. Avoid speaking negatively about your current or previous role. We all know this, but particularly if you are frustrated with your situation at the moment, it can be difficult to try and articulate that professionally. Be able to talk very well about why you've moved on from a business or are looking to move on from a business professionally and positively. So if you do have frustrations about your current management style or the business itself, how they've perhaps confronted some of the COVID issues, for example, just practice how you will say that in a really professional way. Chewing gum is a small one that I just want to mention now that we're coming back to physical interviews after a long time of totally virtual. Completely avoid taking chewing gum into the interview. If you are a smoker, avoid having a cigarette before your interview if you can, for at least a couple of hours before. Don't smoke beforehand and be conservative with fragrance. Again, some of us are a little bit rusty at in-person meetings because we've been online for so long. Being conservative with your aftershave or your perfume is really important. Avoid having little knowledge of the business and the role that you're going for. And in particular, I've just put some things here for us to run through of things that you should be really aware of and well versed on before you interview with the company. So ensure that you've researched key things about the organisation, including when they were established, having a really good understanding of what they do as an organisation. Again, you know, some of this sounds very simple, but we have seen candidates fall down recently on saying, you know, what does your business do? The size and scale of the organisation and the current locations that they operate in. Review some of their recent press releases. Now, this is a really good tip when you're Googling an organisation. Hit news. You may already know to do this, but it will give you a really good indication of where they've been in the press recently. Of course, you're going to look at Glassdoor reviews as well, and be mindful that for some organisations, they may have frontline staff that are unhappy for a number of reasons. They may be a large conglomerate that have had an issue with their retention recently. So definitely review those Glassdoor reviews. And if you have any concerns, bring those forward to interview. Build an understanding of some of the key projects that they're affiliated with, and then prepare questions specifically around those. And the reason that I'd recommend that you prepare questions directly about each of those key projects is that actually it demonstrates not only that you've really taken it seriously and you've researched them, but that they matter to you and that your understanding of the business is important. And almost most vitally, review each of the interview panel on LinkedIn and start to think about questions specifically for each of them. Particularly with physical interviews, engaging with each of the interview panel can be really tricky. And if you look at their background, you can start to decipher different things about each of them that you want to ask and gain from the interview. Remember that every person who attends the interview panel will have a slightly different agenda and a slightly different take on what they're looking for from the right person. So try and review their background, businesses that they've worked with before, interests that they have on LinkedIn, anything they've shared about their family, that you can form questions specifically to them about. So as an example, if you've got a member of HR attending the interview, you may ask them, what's the difference between an exceptional employee and a good employee for this role? You may ask if the CFO is involved in the interview, what are their key concerns about how you can contribute to the profitability of the organisation in the next 2 years? So really tailor your questions for each member of the panel. Avoid discussing salary at first stage. Now, if you are being represented by a consultancy such as Principal People, they will have handled these conversations on your behalf in terms of the salary that you're looking for, so that you can completely avoid that uncomfortable discussion at first interview. But if it is necessary because they've asked you, for example, state the salary that you've previously agreed, But if it's genuine, do follow this up with a statement that salary is just one element of the reason for applying. And be prepared to mention some others, genuine reasons of why you're interested in the opportunity. So for example, the positive challenge that this role will bring you, the ongoing development that they offer, etc. And make sure, as I mentioned a couple of seconds ago, that state that the salary is of course important, but it isn't the main driver for wanting to secure this position. A really important life skill for all of us that work and at home, and particularly in interview format, is to understand that 90% of what you're saying is non-verbal. It may be some time before we're able to shake hands. You know, some organisations are very comfortable with that, others have a completely different stance. So just read the body language when you enter a room and try and decipher the best way to meet that person physically. Be aware of your body language acutely throughout the interview. So what I mean by that is, don't cross your arms, maintain nice open body language, maintain eye contact, smile, all of those very normal things that, again, you know, we've become a bit rusty at because we've been in lockdown various times and not necessarily have been attending interviews as much as you may have been used to pre-COVID. And indeed, it may be some time anyway that before you've attended an interview because this is your first role into health and safety, or you've been with your company for a long time. Eye contact and engagement with each of the panel is hugely important. You may feel a natural affinity with one or two members of the panel, but just remember to try and keep that eye contact and communication going with all. Ensure that you're actively listening to absolutely everything. It's a total natural human part of our being that we listen with the means to talk rather than really listen to what is being said. It's so important that you demonstrate those active listening skills and ensure that you've got the whole picture of what they're asking so that you can come up with the best possible answer. Make a note of questions that you have or things that you'd like to embellish on without needing to interrupt them. So allow the interviewer to finish their sentence. If there's something you really want to jump in and say, make a note of it so that you don't need to interrupt their flow. And present positively with a warm smile, and again, that open body language that is so important. Remember that culture fit is just as important, if not more, to some organisations than your hard skill set. I've seen so many individuals that are what we would call wild cards. They don't necessarily have all of the qualifications and the experience that a company may be looking for, but personality-wise, they are such a good fit for that organisation, be it through their enthusiasm or just that their whole picture of that person and how they would fit into a team and contribute to the dynamic. And we've seen that those candidates are sometimes offered the role over those that have the harder skill set experience. So make sure that you're being genuine, make sure that you're being nothing but yourself, because of course it's really important that it's a match from both sides and culture fit is right for you and vice versa. Being able to articulate your enthusiasm for the role can be quite difficult, especially if you really want the job, which hopefully you do. Sometimes you can be so nervous and excited about this opportunity that it supersedes your ability to actually demonstrate your enthusiasm in a professional way. You will probably be asked what interests you in this job, so practice your answer specifically to that question. Use your knowledge of the company to show your sincere interest and give one or two specific reasons about the role and organisation which particularly appeal to you. Articulate why you are interested in not only this opportunity, but the organisation as a whole. What stands out to you and how does that translate to your current career motivations? Again, when you're nervous, you may just feel the need to just say, you know, I'm really interested, with the ability to completely forget those one or two specific things that really are important to you. And again, demonstrate that you've understood the role, that you've researched the business, and that importantly, this is a long-term career fit for you. Prepare to talk about the additional research that you've carried out in the company and why you want to work with them. I've seen organisations open an interview with why us? Why do you want to work for us? And it can completely throw you. Again, coming back to my point in the first slide, the more that you prepare for these challenging questions, the better equipped you'll be to do very well. Be prepared to answer what parts of the position description relate to your experience specifically. And to support you with this, revisit your key achievements and how they specifically relate to this role. I appreciate that some of you may not have any experience yet in health and safety in particular, but just remember, if you list your key achievements throughout your studies, your schooling, your further education, and any career that you may have had to date, or indeed your ability at home as a parent, list your key achievements and things that you're really proud of in preparation before your interview. And I'd recommend you to do that at least a week before. And I think sometimes by actually taking those moments and sitting down and really listing the things that you're proud of, you start to remember those great achievements and how you could then bring them through to be relevant for the role. Also start to think about the areas of the position description that you feel less comfortable with and any support that you may need with this. Now, again, if you're being represented by a recruitment agency such as Principal People or any other, they should be really hands-on to support you in preparing for your interview. We spend between 45 and an hour with each candidate in preparing you for an interview to make sure that we're running through all areas that we're discussing right now. But if there is something in the position description that's concerning you that you think you're perhaps not quite as competent at, try and think about how you may answer if asked about that in particular, or indeed if you wanted to bring it forward as one of your concerns. There will always be areas of a job description that you're not totally adept with. And I think as long as you're able to discuss how you would overcome that challenge and perhaps other skills that would supersede that, then you'll be absolutely fine. You will absolutely be asked about your weaknesses or what your areas for development are, as well as the challenges that you may have faced over the past 12 months and how you've overcome these. We're seeing lots of organisations ask candidates how they responded to COVID, how they dealt with that period of time and what they did to get through it. Asking about your areas for development is really important as an interviewer, but being on the receiving end of that question, it can be really daunting to try and think about how to answer it. My advice is to think about something that has challenged you that you've managed to overcome. So let's imagine, for example, that you found organisation really difficult in the early days of your role. Think about the steps that you've taken to really hone in on that and get better with your organisation and how that translates to today and how you're coping now. And in your preparation, determine the 3 key factors as to why you want this job in particular. And that can also help you to tidy your mind if you're lucky enough to be considering 2 or 3 opportunities, which we're seeing a lot of at the moment. So that brings me on to the STAR technique, which is something that you may be fairly familiar with. It's an excellent tool for answering challenging interview questions using a really structured approach. And we've recorded improvements in excess of as much as 50% regarding the success rate of candidates who use the STAR technique over those who don't. STAR really helps you to articulately summarise your experience and experience related particularly to this role using specific examples and appropriate levels of detail. And I'll take us through to an example, but STAR stands for situation, task, action and results. And you can blend this to any interview competency question that you're asked. So the concept of STAR is building concise stories into your answers to competency question. And each story should start with a brief outline of the situation and have a clear beginning, middle and end. And you'll try to present your answer in such a way as to highlight your relevant skills and of course suitability to the role on offer. So let's review an example of exactly what this looks like. The question that's being posed to you at interview is to describe a time that you dealt with pressure in a work situation. You might answer with something like the following. So the situation was, I was working with a team of 3 preparing an audit for an OSAS 18001 certification for one of our main clients. We were confident we'd complete the project to schedule, but then 2 team members, including the contract manager, fell seriously ill. So you've given a really brief overview of the situation, and you'll now move on to the task section of your answer, which should outline the job that you faced, setting out the goals and objectives for your team and the company. So the team was suddenly under serious pressure to meet a deadline on which a substantial budget had already been invested. We were required to meet the original deadline, and with depleted personnel and an obvious lack of on-site leadership. So you're really starting to paint that story, and you're doing it just in a couple of brief paragraphs. The most detailed part of your answer will be the action, where you'll describe how you dealt with the task. And here, you'll detail your use of available resources, the personal and relevant skills that you brought to the table, and your direct involvement. I was up to speed with all aspects of the project and confident in my operational skills through prior experience, so I became a hands-on junior project manager. I motivated the team by arranging incentives, including a bonus on completion and 2 food evenings in the office. The incentives enabled us to effectively broaden our own time frame on the project and run checks on the site prior to presentation to the board. The action part of your answer should leave your interviewer in no doubt as to what it was that you did to respond to the situation and challenge, how you did it, and why you did it. You'll now need to wrap up your answer by outlining the results of your actions. And this is where you get to demonstrate the benefits that those actions had for the company and the team, and of course for your own development. So in this case, the result would sound something like, under my interim leadership, the team completed the recertification successfully on time. The client was so pleased with how we'd pulled resource together quickly and achieved certification that they renewed their contract for another 2 years and referred 2 sister companies to our services. So you can see how using STAR has really helped you to build a story, paint a picture, but concisely talk about the beginning, middle, and end of that story. And it prevents you from going off on a bit of a tangent. Remember that rehearsals are key. I would highly recommend that you prepare 5 STAR stories based on achievements relevant to the key selection criteria that the role requires. Again, if you're leaning on a great consultancy, they should be able to help you to pick out the key selection criteria of the role. But if you've applied directly, you can do that on your own autonomously using the position description and your knowledge of the position. And again, depending on how much you really want this role, I'd recommend you to actually thought map that and put it down on paper to really understand what they're looking for and the experience that you could lean on. Again, don't worry if you don't have direct working experience in the role that you're going for, because through listing the key achievements that we spoke about a few slides ago, you should start to have confidence in your own ability that there are other skill sets you can bring to the table. Think of how you can present your answers and achievements to suit different questions. Deliver your STAR answers in well under 3 minutes and always keep it positive, upbeat, and free from heavy jargon. I would recommend you to draw up competency questions that you think that the client may ask. And again, this is literally getting the position description and thinking for each criteria of the role, what competency questions might they ask you? And then again, depending on the time and energy you want to put into getting this role, of course, I'd always recommend that the more the better. Create 2 to 3 possible examples that could answer each of those competency questions. This is a difficult one because, as I said at the beginning, most of us are pretty underconfident when it comes to interviewing, and being confident in yourself and striking that balance between your confidence and not sort of, presenting yourself too strongly. You need to consider what sets you apart from other candidates and really take time to think about that. What is different about you? What sets you apart? Why should a business want to hire you? What do you have to bring to the table? What do you have that you feel could be unique? And be prepared to answer the question, tell me about yourself. A lot of candidates actually find this one really daunting. So create a 15-second soundbite that describes your professional background and a little about yourself outside of work in 2 to 3 sentences. Where possible, use facts and statistics to add substance to your answer. So for example, if you've reduced lost time injury by 25% within 1 year, use this accomplishment when discussing your key achievements. When you think back to preparing your STAR answers and your competency question, 2 to 3 examples for each, try and use those facts and stats as much as possible. Of course, it may not be relevant to you, but where possible, do blend it through. Now, questions from you at the end of the interview is possibly one of the most important things, and employers can place as much as 45% on the decision-making process on the quality of questions asked. Good questions can absolutely help to recover average performance in an interview, but on the other hand, a bad question can count against you, as is saying, I don't have any questions to ask. I know lots of clients and organisations, interviewers, that if somebody says they don't have any questions, it's actually going to completely stop them from proceeding because it just demonstrates a lack of genuine interest in the role. I'd recommend that you prepare at least 10 questions that you'd like to ask during the interview. And remember that in some awful cases, the interviewer may start with those to ensure that you have things prepared. Because a lot of the time candidates may say, actually, everything that I wanted to ask has already been answered naturally through this conversation. So preparing at least 10 should mean that you've got a few good questions left up your sleeve to ask. So I thought it might be handy to suggest some questions that you could ask at this current point in time. And again, it depends entirely on the level of role that you're going forward for and your own experience. But you may want to ask about the current challenges the organisation are finding within your role remit. So whatever you're going forward for, discuss specifically that role and how it contributes to the organisation and what challenges they're finding within that role or team. The growth and expansion strategy that the business are planning for over the coming 3 years, and fundamentally how your role can support them with this. It demonstrates that you're looking forward to a long-term career with that business. You may have already done a bit of research about the growth and expansion strategy, so do bring that into the conversation if you know it already and ask a further question about it. But importantly, how your role can support them in achieving that strategy. Where they see that your role function could contribute to the profitability of the business and add clear value, especially as most of us will not be in a revenue generating function. So therefore, what value do they see in your role? Discuss the key deliverables of your role function within the first 12 months. And that is literally saying, what are your expectations of me as a good performer in the first 3 to 6 months of my role with you? And what would the key deliverables be within the first 12 months? Talk about areas in your skills and experience that they would like more clarification on. Remember to have questions for each of the interview panel, which are specifically for them. Ask what a typical career path looks like for this role, again, to really demonstrate that you are interested in the longer term. If your direct manager is in the interview, which is likely, and you've spent time looking at their LinkedIn profile, which I would of course thoroughly recommend, you may see how they have progressed through the business, and you'd use that as an example and talk to them about how they achieved that progression. But if you've taken it a step further and you've also looked at the LinkedIn profiles of other members of the team, that's a really good thing to bring into the conversation. So for example, I saw that your senior health and safety advisor, Dominic, progressed within the first year of his role and then 2 years later was promoted again. What did he do really well in order to achieve that progression? Again, demonstrates that research, but also your hunger for career development. If I'm successful, what projects will I initially take on? What are the strategic issues and challenges that your company is facing? Where do you expect the organisation to be in 3 years? What are the board's key priorities this year? And what do you see as the most exciting developments or opportunities for the company at present? So they are a few suggested questions. As I said at the beginning, if you want any help, if there's a particular role that you're going for and you would just like 4 or 5 questions that may be good to ask at interview, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I also thought it might be helpful to add in some challenging questions that we've known to be asked in recent times, because they're good ones to have up your sleeve to prepare for. What is the biggest failure that you've had in your career to date? I think if you were asked that question right now, it would be pretty difficult if you haven't prepared for what you were going to say. So have a think about that. A bit like the areas for development, of course, you don't want to talk about something that ruined your career or prevented you from working for a period of time. You want to talk about something that was a real challenge for you, that you overcame and that you've managed to use as a positive experience now moving forward in your career. The next one, can you give me an example of where you've had to be dishonest with somebody for the greater good of the business? Again, organisations may be asking you questions to understand your personality, your ability to deal with conflict, whether you have tendencies to be political in any way. It's really important to try and, of course, you're going to be honest in your answer here, but think about some of those more negative decisions that you've had to make, or things that you perhaps regret in your career, and how you would overcome questions about those if asked. How will you ensure the systems and standards that you put in place are sufficient to keep customers, staff, and our reputation safe? In your experience, what controls have worked well and what not so well? Can you explain how you'll contribute to developing a culture of high performance across all teams, in particular dealing with poor performance? And if you're going in for a leadership role, how will you get the best from your team by month 3, 6, and 12 of your new working relationship? And lastly, how do you approach empowering others to gain their total buy-in to a new procedural system? And if you think back to STAR technique, you can use that structure to answer each of these questions on the screen. At the close of the interview, confirm your level of interest in the role, if of course that is genuine, and ask for the next steps. It's really important to understand when you're likely to hear back from them, to clarify any areas of your experience that they need to go into more detail on, and just understand what will happen moving forward. Okay, and I think we finished quite a bit before time, but I was conscious of this being death by PowerPoint as well. So at this stage, I'm really happy to take any questions that you may have.
Thank you for that, Tara. It was very informative. As we mentioned at the beginning, if you have got any questions, then please feel free to type those in the questions area on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll take 5 to 10 minutes now to address those. Whilst we wait for any questions to come through, there are a few that have sprung to mind for me. So the first is, where do you see candidates fall down in the interview stage most commonly? Is there sort of something that a lot of people struggle with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's the confidence piece. We're hearing that so much at the moment, and it can be really surprising because we can be dealing with a candidate who so much wants the opportunity, who has come across fantastically throughout their process with us, but unfortunately, you know, down to preparation or perhaps just busyness in their outside lives. Perhaps they were up late the night before because they were so worried about the interview, they put too much pressure on it. They just haven't performed very well. So I think it's just that confidence piece. And again, that's why I would always recommend over preparing as much as possible.
Yes, definitely. And I know from my own experience as well, when I've been preparing for interviews, I found it really helpful to actually sort of stand in front of the mirror and practice the questions, actually saying them out loud as opposed to just, you know, going through in your head. Yeah,
that's
I found personally that helps a lot more. Okay, so then what is the most negative feedback you hear from clients?
I think it would be, in recent times, just lack of knowledge about a business and their challenges. And, you know, it's not always a candidate's fault. It may be that that information isn't readily in the public domain. It may be that you're dealing directly with the business, so you haven't been able to get as much information as you want. But I think just it's so important to spend, you know, 30, 60 minutes researching a business because you're applying to work for their organization. So that's definitely a piece of negative feedback that we hear time and again, is just organizations feeling that candidates have come across for roles that they don't know huge amounts about, and the client has been completely under-researched.
And is that the same for all levels of roles, or is there a difference between the more junior and more senior roles, do you think?
I think that certainly for more senior roles, the expectation of how much research you've done and what you're researching is, of course, different to more junior roles. But even, you know, we've just taken on board 8 people within Principal People, and some of those have come into fairly junior posts within the organisation. But regardless, you still want to see that that person knows what you do as a business, you know, the basics when you're established, how you've grown. And I've seen some really impressive individuals who've clearly taken the time to look at people's LinkedIn profiles, to look at your mission statements, to see your latest news and what that's meant for you as a business. I think it just means an awful lot when an interview is taking time to meet somebody, that you show your genuine interest in working for that business.
Definitely. Okay, and then final question from me is, if somebody doesn't have experience working in health and safety, and perhaps that's because they're relatively new to the world of work, or they've worked in a different discipline prior to deciding to move into health and safety, how can they put their best foot forward at interview?
Yeah, I think that enthusiasm and culture fit, as we talked about a little while ago, stands for so much. I would recommend you to try and get, if it's 2 written recommendations or whether they're references from respected professionals throughout your time, to talk about your skill set in terms of resilience, how you deal with particularly challenging situations, how you contribute to the dynamics of a working team and business. Those are all skills that most organisations will look for and will lend themselves to most roles. And I think, again, your passion for what you're applying to do is such a key part. So if you've not worked in health and safety before, perhaps you've completed your NEBOSH and you've, perhaps you've completed some work experience for a short couple of months, it's really important to be able to help the client understand why it is that you want to work in health and safety, what's important to you, where do you feel this could go for you, and why do you think that the business that you're interviewing with is the best place to start your career in health and safety.
Okay, great. So we've had a few people ask if it's possible to share the presentation, and as I mentioned, we'll add this to our YouTube channel after the event, so people will be able to go and recap and take note of all of the good tips in their own time. We have had a question from Joseph, who's asked, do you have any tips for giving a presentation within an interview as opposed to the usual kind of question and answer format?
Yes, absolutely. And obviously, you know, a lot of businesses are asking for presentations a lot of the time. I think a little bit like preparing for answering your questions, keep it fairly brief, you know, 10 to 20 minutes. I'd say nobody enjoys being talked at for a really long time, and find ways to engage with the interview panel. So it may be that your presentation includes questions for them. So as an example, you know, I want to understand what is your main challenge across risk assessments right now, because it may be that you've got a slide that talks about your approach to risk assessments in your role. I would always ask for advice from whoever your contact is within that business, if you're not dealing with a consultancy, on how many slides, you know, how long should it be, and what topics should I try and cover. There are some incredible pieces of technology out there now. I'm a real user of Prezi, for any of you who may know. You can add animations and it can bring things to life. But I think, again, the content is so important of what you're actually discussing. I would recommend printing copies of your presentation and making them available to the interview panel. But of course, you need to be conscious as well of people's sustainability policies, and that actually they may not take kindly to printing it. So you might want to email it in advance or after the interview itself. But I'd say just ensure that you're covering the key points, but then also trying to bring in some of the key selection criteria for the role. So if somebody's given you a really brief outline of 3 or 4 key points that you should cover in your presentation, consider adding in 1 or 2 that you feel may be really relevant for that key selection criteria. But remember that overall, you want to be keeping your presentation fairly concise. Presenting is also a really, really good opportunity to show your personality. So how you would engage with people. If, for example, toolbox talks is going to be part of your role, how you bring yourself to life in a room and how you engage with people, maintaining eye contact, your confidence, kind of slowing down your voice that little bit so that you don't make too many stumbling mistakes, are all really important parts of presenting. And if you're going for a role where presenting to external clients is part of your position within that business, then obviously there's that added pressure to make sure that you do a really good job. So practice your presentation to people that you trust, but also if you've got a mentor in your career, somebody who is much more senior and may understand what a company would be looking for, ask if you could present to them.
Okay. That's all the questions. Thank you so much, Tara, for sharing your knowledge with us today. I think everyone's probably found that very useful. Thank you to everyone for joining us as well. We've just had a few thank yous come through on the questions also. As I mentioned, this webinar has been recorded and we will pop the recording on our YouTube channel as soon as possible. So you will be able to go back and recap on all of the good advice Tara has shared in your own time. Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.